The fluorescent lights of Oak Ridge County Courthouse cast a harsh glare on the polished wooden surfaces, creating an atmosphere that felt both sterile and oppressive. Judge Robert Hartley adjusted his reading glasses, his weathered hands betraying years of judicial authority that had gone unchallenged for decades. Jasmine Williams stood at the plaintiff's table, her crisp navy blue suit a stark contrast to the muted tones of the courtroom. At 32, she represented a new generation of attorneys, brilliant, fearless, and unwilling to accept the silent prejudices that had long dominated the legal landscape. Ms. Williams, Hartley's voice cut through the morning silence like a razor. Your motion is fundamentally flawed. The precedent you're citing was overturned in 1997, and your argument shows a remarkable lack of judicial understanding. Her colleagues in the back of the courtroom exchanged nervous glances. They knew Jasmine's reputation. She wasn't someone who would back down easily. Her research was always impeccable, her arguments meticulously prepared. Your Honor, Jasmine responded, her voice steady and controlled. If you'll allow me to elaborate, the Thompson v. State ruling actually provides a nuanced interpretation that directly supports my motion. Hartley's face reddened. He was a judge who prided himself on being the ultimate authority, and here was a young black woman challenging his interpretation. The courtroom felt electrically charged, with every observer sensing the underlying tension. Elaborate quickly, Ms. Williams, he snapped, because I'm growing increasingly impatient with what seems to be a desperate attempt to muddy clear legal waters. Jasmine began her explanation, her words precise and her legal reasoning impeccable. She quoted case law, referenced intricate legal precedents, and demonstrated a depth of understanding that would have impressed even the most seasoned legal scholars. But Judge Hartley wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. Ms. Williams, he interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. Your motion is denied. Furthermore, I'm imposing a $5,000 sanctions fee for what I consider a frivolous and poorly researched legal argument. The courtroom gasped. A $5,000 sanction was extraordinarily harsh, especially for a motion that was well-researched and professionally presented. Jasmine felt the heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a controlled anger that had been generations in the making. This wasn't just about a legal motion. This was about something far deeper. Her client, an elderly black man who had been fighting an unjust property dispute, looked devastated. Years of hope seemed to drain from his eyes in that single moment. As Jasmine gathered her documents, she locked eyes with Judge Hartley. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. Outside the courtroom, the summer heat pressed against the courthouse windows. Jasmine's paralegal, Marcus, approached her with a mix of anger and concern. That was completely unfair, he whispered. We have grounds for a formal complaint. Jasmine's response was measured, almost calm. Not a complaint, Marcus. Something much more significant. Little did Judge Hartley know that this moment would become a turning point, not just in Jasmine's career, but in his own life. The wheels of justice were already in motion, and they were about to come full circle in a way no one could have predicted. Would you like me to continue with part 2 or refine any aspect of this expanded first part? The $5,000 sanction hit Jasmine's small law practice like a financial tsunami. Her office, a modest 2-room space in downtown Atlanta, suddenly felt more like a pressure cooker of stress and uncertainty. Marcus Thompson, her most trusted paralegal, spread the documents across their shared conference table. His dark eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and strategic calculation. This isn't just a fine. This is a professional assassination attempt. Jasmine knew the stakes. As a black woman who had clawed her way through Harvard Law, surviving on scholarships and late-night study sessions, every professional setback carried exponentially more weight. Her family's history was etched with stories of systemic barriers. Her grandfather had been unable to vote until the 1960s. Her mother had integrated her local school system, and now Jasmine was fighting her own battle in the judicial arena. Her phone began to ring. First, her mentor, retired Judge Elizabeth Garrett, a legendary civil rights attorney. Are you okay? The older woman's voice carried decades of similar struggles. On calculating our next move, Jasmine responded, her voice calm but determined. The financial impact was immediate. The $5,000 sanction meant delaying payments to her two part-time legal assistants. It meant potentially losing the small commercial lease they'd worked so hard to secure. More importantly, it threatened her reputation in a legal ecosystem where perception was almost as critical as actual performance. Local legal circles began to whisper. Some colleagues subtly suggested she should tone down her approach, a thinly veiled recommendation to be more submissive. Others saw an opportunity to distance themselves from what they perceived as a potentially problematic attorney. But Jasmine Williams wasn't built for submission. She spent the next week meticulously documenting every interaction with Judge Hartley. Digital recordings, court transcripts, previous rulings. She created a comprehensive portfolio that would become her weapon of professional survival. Her client, Robert Jenkins, the elderly man whose property dispute had initiated the original hearing, visited her office. His weathered hands trembled as he spoke. "They've been trying to push me out of my family land for years. Don't let them win." The personal became professional. This wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. This was about a systemic pattern of judicial discrimination that had plagued generations. Marcus began compiling statistical data. They discovered something alarming. Judge Hartley's courtroom showed a consistent pattern of harsher sanctions and rulings against Black attorneys and plaintiffs. What had happened to Jasmine wasn't an isolated incident. It was a systemic problem. Late one night, surrounded by legal documents and statistical charts, Jasmine made her decision. She would not just file a complaint. She would create a comprehensive case that would expose the deeper, more insidious forms of judicial racism. Her strategy began taking shape, a multi-pronged approach that would involve the Judicial Conduct Review Board, civil rights organizations, and potentially federal judicial oversight. "This isn't about revenge," she told Marcus. "This is about accountability." The legal community watched, some with anticipation, others with nervousness. Jasmine Williams was preparing to challenge not just a judge, but an entire system of unspoken judicial prejudice. As dawn broke over Atlanta, casting long shadows across her office, Jasmine knew her next moves would define not just her career, but potentially create a pathway for systemic change. The fight was just beginning. Would you like me to continue with Part 3 or refine any aspect of this section? The next 6 months became a masterclass in strategic professional advancement. Jasmine transformed her initial setback into a calculated career trajectory that would shape the foundations of the judicial system. She began by reaching out to the Southern Poverty Law Center and the National Bar Association's Civil Rights Committee. Her meticulously documented case against Judge Hartley caught their attention immediately. What started as a personal challenge was quickly becoming a landmark investigation into judicial misconduct. Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez, a prominent civil rights legal scholar, took a personal interest in Jasmine's case. "You're not just fighting for yourself," she told Jasmine during a strategy meeting. "You're creating a blueprint for systemic accountability." Jasmine's approach was multifaceted. By day, she continued her legal practice, taking on civil rights cases that others would hesitate to touch. By night, she developed a comprehensive research project documenting racial disparities in judicial rulings across 3 metropolitan counties. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly. A series of data visualization presentations she created caught the attention of the State Judicial Oversight Committee. The graphics were devastating. Clear, irrefutable evidence of systemic bias that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. Marcus helped her compile the research, working late into the night. "This isn't just a report," he would say. "This is evidence." The speaking circuit became her next strategic platform. Jasmine began presenting at legal conferences, law schools, and judicial training seminars. Her presentations were a combination of hard data, personal narrative, and systemic analysis that left audiences stunned. Her reputation grew. Law students began citing her research. Civil rights attorneys sought her counsel. What Judge Hartley had intended as a professional takedown was transforming into a launching pad for significant change. The National Lawyers Guild invited her to present at their annual conference. Her keynote address became a viral sensation, with clips shared across social media platforms. She spoke not with anger, but with a calculated precision that exposed the systemic issues plaguing the judicial system. Behind the scenes, Jasmine was building a network. She connected with progressive judges, civil rights attorneys, and academic researchers who were committed to judicial reform. Each connection was strategic, each relationship carefully cultivated. Her mentor, retired Judge Elizabeth Garrett, watched with pride. "You're doing something extraordinary," she told Jasmine. "You're turning a personal attack into a movement." The Judicial Conduct Review Board began to take notice. Her comprehensive research wasn't just a complaint, it was a sophisticated analysis of systemic judicial bias. She wasn't just naming problems, she was proposing concrete solutions. Funding began to flow. Grants from civil rights organizations supported her continued research. Law schools invited her as a guest lecturer. Her small law practice transformed into a hub of civil rights legal strategy. By the end of the year, Jasmine had become more than just an attorney. She was becoming a recognized expert in judicial accountability, her name synonymous with systemic legal reform. Judge Hartley, meanwhile, remained unaware of the storm gathering around him. He continued his judicial duties, believing his actions would go unchallenged. Little did he know that Jasmine was systematically building a case that would not just challenge him, but fundamentally reshape the understanding of judicial accountability. As the new year approached, Jasmine knew her next move would be her most significant yet. The pieces were falling into place, a complex chess game where she was several moves ahead. The judicial system was about to be put on trial. Would you like me to continue with Part 4 or refine any aspect of this section? The invitation arrived on crisp official letterhead from the State Judicial Appointment Committee. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and strategic calculation. She had been selected for a preliminary interview for the Judicial Conduct Review Board, a position that would give her unprecedented access to investigate judicial misconduct across the state. The selection process was notoriously competitive. Typically, candidates came from established judicial families or had decades of political connections. Jasmine represented something entirely different, a young black attorney who had made her reputation by challenging the system from the outside. Her interview was scheduled for a crisp December morning. Marcus helped her prepare, running mock interviews that became increasingly intense. "They're going to try to break you," he warned. "Your composure is your greatest weapon." The committee room was a study in institutional power. 12 members sat behind a massive mahogany table, their collective gaze feeling like a weight pressing down on Jasmine. Among them was Judge Harold Weinstein, a legendary figure in judicial oversight, known for his razor-sharp intellect and zero-tolerance approach to judicial misconduct. "Ms. Williams," Weinstein began, "your research on judicial bias is provocative. What makes you believe you can be objective when you've been so vocal about systemic issues?" Jasmine's response was carefully measured. "Objectivity isn't about neutrality, Judge Weinstein. It's about seeing the full complexity of justice. My research doesn't seek to destroy, but to repair." The room fell silent. It was a response that cut through political posturing, revealing a depth of understanding that few expected. Behind the scenes, additional investigations were underway. Jasmine's comprehensive research had caught the attention of several key players in the judicial system. Her documentation of Judge Hartley's pattern of bias was becoming impossible to ignore. What the committee didn't know was the depth of Jasmine's preparation. Her research extended beyond Hartley, revealing a network of judicial misconduct that touched multiple counties and judicial districts. 3 weeks after the interview, the call came. Jasmine was not just selected for the Judicial Conduct Review Board, she was being recommended for a senior investigative position. Her first assignment would be a comprehensive review of judicial conduct complaints from the past 5 years. The irony wasn't lost on her. The system that had once tried to silence her was now giving her a platform to create systemic change. Judge Elizabeth Garrett called to congratulate her. "They're afraid of you," she said candidly. "And they should be. Real change has always come from those willing to challenge the status quo." The news spread quickly through legal circles. Some celebrated, others viewed her appointment with suspicion. Jasmine knew she was walking a razor's edge. One misstep could derail everything she had worked for. Her first official act would be to pull the complete judicial file of Robert Hartley, the very judge who had tried to end her career months ago. As she prepared her first official investigation, Jasmine reflected on the journey. What had started as a personal humiliation was now a systematic approach to judicial accountability. The night before her first official day, she stood in her home office, surrounded by years of research, documentation, and personal determination. A photograph of her grandfather, who had fought for voting rights decades earlier, watched from the wall. She was ready. The judicial system was about to face its most comprehensive review in decades. Would you like me to continue with Part 5 or refine any aspect of this section? The weight of history pressed down on Judge Robert Hartley as he sat in his private study, surrounded by decades of legal volumes and family photographs. For the first time in his long career, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. Initial reports from the Judicial Conduct Review Board began trickling in, subtle at first, then with increasing intensity. Each document was a microscopic examination of his judicial history, revealing patterns he had long ignored or dismissed as inconsequential. His wife, Margaret, a retired school administrator, noticed the change first. The confident swagger that had defined Robert for decades was replaced by a nervous energy. Late at night, she would find him surrounded by old case files, re-examining rulings he had once considered beyond reproach. Memories began to surface. Moments of casual racism that he had rationalized as judicial strictness now looked starkly different. The young black attorney he had publicly humiliated, Jasmine Williams, had become more than just a footnote in his career. She was now the architect of his potential professional downfall. Old colleagues began distancing themselves. Retirement parties became awkward. Conversations grew stilted. The legal community he had dominated for decades was slowly, methodically turning away. A particularly damning set of statistics arrived in a thick manila envelope. Comparative analysis of his rulings showed a stark disparity. Black attorneys received 67% more sanctions. Black plaintiffs faced significantly harsher judgments, and cases involving minority participants consistently resulted in more severe outcomes. Hartley's hands shook as he reviewed the documents. These weren't accusations. These were mathematically precise indictments of his entire judicial career. Flashbacks consumed him. He remembered his early years in the judicial system, the unspoken rules that had guided his generation, the subtle nods, the understanding glances, the systemic bias that had been so deeply ingrained it felt like natural law. His son, Michael, a progressive civil rights attorney, had tried to challenge these perspectives for years. Their relationship had been strained, with heated arguments about systemic racism that Hartley had always dismissed. "You're seeing ghosts where there are no ghosts," he had told Michael repeatedly. Now, those ghosts were becoming uncomfortably real. Therapy sessions became a crucial lifeline. A recommended counselor specializing in institutional bias began helping Hartley deconstruct decades of unconscious prejudice. Each session was a painful excavation of deeply held beliefs. "This isn't about destroying you," his therapist, Dr. Rebecca Chen, explained carefully. "This is about understanding how systemic racism operates beyond individual intentions." The most painful confrontation came from within. Hartley began to truly see the young attorneys he had marginalized, the plaintiffs he had dismissed, the lives he had impacted through his narrow interpretation of justice. Jasmine Williams became more than just a name. She represented a generation demanding accountability, a systemic reckoning that could no longer be ignored. Late one night, surrounded by decades of legal documentation, Hartley made a profound decision. He would not fight the investigation. He would cooperate fully, understanding that true redemption required complete transparency. A draft of a potential public statement took shape, not a defensive argument, but a genuine acknowledgement of his own limitations and the systemic biases that had shaped his judicial career. The judicial system that had protected him for decades was now demanding its own transformation, and Robert Hartley found himself at the center of that profound, uncomfortable change. His world was collapsing, but perhaps from those ruins, something more just could be constructed. Would you like me to continue with part 6 or refine any aspect of this section? The hearing room buzzed with an electric tension that transcended typical judicial proceedings. Journalists packed the gallery, legal experts lined the walls, and the air felt charged with historical significance. Jasmine Williams sat at the primary investigative table, her navy blue suit crisp, her posture a perfect blend of professional composure and quiet determination. Beside her, a team of researchers and civil rights legal experts prepared their comprehensive presentation. Judge Harold Weinstein, head of the Judicial Conduct Review Board, adjusted his glasses. His reputation for surgical precision was well known, and today's hearing would be his most significant investigation in decades. We will now review the judicial conduct of Judge Robert Hartley, Weinstein announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of anticipation. Jasmine's presentation was a masterpiece of legal strategy. She didn't just present accusations, she constructed a comprehensive narrative of systemic bias. Digital presentations displayed statistical analyses, comparative case studies, and meticulously documented patterns of discriminatory judicial behavior. Each slide was a surgical strike, graphs showing racial disparities in sentencing, comparative analyses of case outcomes, detailed documentation of repeated patterns of bias that extended far beyond individual incidents. Robert Hartley sat across the room, no longer the imperious judge who had once dominated courtrooms. He looked smaller, more vulnerable. Years of unchallenged authority had crumbled in the face of irrefutable evidence. Between 2005 and 2020, Jasmine explained, her voice steady and professional, Judge Hartley's court demonstrated a consistent pattern of bias that cannot be explained by judicial discretion. Her team had prepared for months. They had interviewed dozens of attorneys, analyzed thousands of case files, and created a forensic examination of judicial misconduct that went beyond individual incidents. The most powerful moment came when Jasmine presented personal testimonies. Attorneys who had been marginalized, plaintiffs who had been systematically disadvantaged, all sharing their experiences in Judge Hartley's courtroom. This isn't about revenge, she stated clearly. This is about accountability and systemic transformation. Marcus Thompson managed the technical presentation, ensuring each piece of evidence was crystal clear. Years of research had culminated in this moment. Judge Hartley's legal team attempted several defensive strategies. They tried to challenge the methodology, question the statistical analysis, argue about context and interpretation. But the evidence was overwhelming. Weinstein's questioning was particularly brutal. He dissected Hartley's arguments with a clinical precision that left no room for equivocation. How do you explain these consistent patterns? Weinstein would ask, presenting graph after graph, document after document. Hartley's responses grew increasingly weak. The confident judge who had once publicly humiliated Jasmine was now reduced to stammering explanations and increasingly desperate justifications. The hearing wasn't just about one judge. It had become a broader examination of systemic judicial racism, with Hartley as the primary case study. Media outlets live-streamed the proceedings. Law schools would use this hearing as a critical teaching moment for generations of future attorneys. As the day progressed, it became clear that this was more than a judicial review. This was a profound moment of institutional reckoning. Jasmine remained composed throughout. She wasn't seeking personal victory, but systemic transformation. When the first day of hearings concluded, Everyone knew something fundamental had changed. The old systems of judicial protection were crumbling, replaced by a demand for true accountability. The reckoning had begun. Would you like me to continue with Part 7 or refine any aspect of this section? The final day of the hearing arrived with a tension that felt almost physical. The hearing room, typically a bastion of procedural formality, now felt like a crucible of historical transformation. Judge Harold Weinstein's preliminary remarks set the tone. This is not about punishment, he began, but about understanding and rectifying systemic failures within our judicial system. Jasmine's final presentation was a masterpiece of legal strategy. She didn't just present evidence, she offered a comprehensive blueprint for judicial reform. Each recommendation was carefully constructed, balancing accountability with the possibility of institutional healing. The recommendations were groundbreaking. 1. Complete removal of Judge Hartley from judicial duties. 2. Mandatory retraining for all judicial personnel in the county. 3. Implementation of blind review processes for judicial decisions. 4. Creation of an independent oversight committee for judicial conduct. 5. Comprehensive review of all cases handled by Hartley in the past decade. But it was her personal statement that truly captured the room's attention. This isn't about destroying a career, Jasmine said, her voice steady but filled with emotional depth. This is about rebuilding a system that promises justice for all, regardless of race, background, or socioeconomic status. The statistical evidence was devastating. Analysis showed that in Hartley's court, Black defendants received 47% longer sentences. Minority attorneys faced 62% more professional sanctions. Civil cases involving minority plaintiffs were 55% more likely to be dismissed. Each number represented a human story of systemic oppression. Judge Hartley's defense team had been reduced to a desperate attempt to mitigate damages. Their arguments sounded increasingly hollow against the mountain of evidence. The most powerful moment came when victims were allowed to speak. Attorneys who had been marginalized, plaintiffs who had been systematically disadvantaged, all shared their experiences. One particularly moving testimony came from Marcus Thompson, who detailed how systemic bias had impacted his own family's interactions with the judicial system. Weinstein's questioning became increasingly pointed. How do you explain these consistent patterns of discrimination? He asked Hartley, presenting document after document. Hartley's responses grew weaker. The once confident judge now appeared diminished, the weight of his actions visibly crushing his previous sense of authority. The hearing transcended a simple judicial review. It had become a broader examination of systemic racism within institutional frameworks. When the final recommendations were read, the room fell silent. Jasmine had transformed a personal moment of humiliation into a systemic catalyst for change. The judgment was nuanced. Immediate removal from judicial duties, mandatory comprehensive bias training, public acknowledgement of systemic misconduct, prohibition from future judicial appointments, requirement to participate in community reconciliation programs. But it wasn't just about punishment. The recommendations included pathways for potential redemption and institutional learning. Media outlets descended into a frenzy. Law schools began immediately incorporating the hearing into their curriculum. Civil rights organizations celebrated a landmark moment. For Jasmine, this was never about personal victory. It was about systemic transformation. As cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes, she remained composed. The young Black woman who had been publicly humiliated years ago had now fundamentally reshaped the judicial landscape. Her grandfather's photograph seemed to watch from somewhere, a testament to generations of struggle and incremental progress. The judicial system would never be the same. Would you like me to continue with Part 8 or refine any aspect of this section? 2 years after the landmark hearing, the landscape of judicial accountability had been dramatically transformed. Jasmine Williams stood at the podium of the National Judicial Reform Conference, no longer just an attorney, but a recognized leader in systemic change. Her work had sparked a nationwide movement. states across the country began implementing robust judicial oversight mechanisms, inspired by the comprehensive reforms she had championed. Judge Robert Hartley's journey of redemption was equally remarkable. Rather than retreating in shame, he had chosen a path of active accountability. He began speaking at diversity training sessions, sharing his personal journey of recognizing and confronting unconscious bias. His son Michael, once estranged, now worked alongside him in civil rights advocacy. Their reconciliation became a powerful narrative of personal and institutional transformation. The judicial reform program Jasmine developed became a national model. It wasn't just about punishing individual actors, but about creating systemic mechanisms for continuous improvement and accountability. Key components of the program included mandatory implicit bias training for all judicial personnel, anonymous reporting systems for judicial misconduct, comprehensive statistical tracking of judicial decisions, diverse recruitment programs for judicial appointments. Marcus Thompson, her former paralegal, now led the research division of the newly established Judicial Accountability Institute. Their work had become a beacon of hope for legal professionals fighting systemic inequality. At home, Jasmine reflected on the journey. The $5,000 sanction that had once threatened to destroy her career had become the catalyst for a nationwide movement. Her mentor, retired Judge Elizabeth Garrett, visited her office. "You've done something extraordinary," she told Jasmine. "You've shown that true justice is about healing, not just punishment." The most profound changes were happening at the grassroots level. Law schools began incorporating comprehensive courses on judicial equity. Young lawyers were entering the profession with a new understanding of systemic challenges. Hartley's public transformation became a powerful narrative of personal growth. In speaking engagements, he would openly discuss his journey, providing a raw, honest account of confronting personal bias. "I thought I was being fair," he would say in his talks. "But fairness requires understanding, not just following rules." The national conversation around judicial accountability had fundamentally shifted. What was once considered radical was now becoming standard practice. Jasmine's personal life had transformed as well. She married Michael Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney she had met during the reform process. Their partnership became another symbol of systemic change and personal connection. Their first child, named after her grandfather, represented a new generation of hope and possibility. The Judicial Conduct Review Board, once a relatively obscure institution, now became a powerful mechanism for ensuring institutional accountability. Jasmine's initial investigation had opened the floodgates for comprehensive reform. Media coverage celebrated the transformation. What had begun as a personal story of confronting judicial bias had become a national movement for systemic change. During a particularly moving conference, Jasmine reflected on the journey. "Change isn't about destroying systems," she told the audience. "It's about reimagining what's possible when we truly commit to justice." Her grandfather's photograph, which had watched over her through every challenge, seemed to smile. The judicial system was healing. Slowly, persistently, with hope and determination. As sunset painted the conference hall in golden light, Jasmine understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The work of justice is never truly finished. Would you like me to refine or elaborate on any aspect of this final part?